Imagine it's a Saturday morning. You're sitting on the floor. Around you are wooden boards, screws, and an instruction manual that looks more like an IQ test than assembly instructions. 30 minutes pass, then an hour. At some point, you're convinced you've done everything correctly. You tighten the final screw, stand the bookshelf upright, take a step back, and realize one of the shelves is installed backwards. Now, you have to take half the thing apart and start over. It's frustrating, and that's exactly why this story seems so absurd, because despite that frustration, millions of people around the world keep coming back to IKEA. They buy more products. They spend their own time assembling them. They do work that manufacturers used to do themselves. And afterward, many of them claim they actually like those pieces of furniture more than others. Why? For years, that question fascinated psychologists, economists, and marketing experts. Eventually, it led to the discovery of a phenomenon now known as the IKEA effect. But to understand why our brains work this way, we need to travel back to a place that looked more like an ordinary Swedish countryside than the birthplace of a global empire. The story begins in 1926 in southern Sweden. In a small village called Pieteryd, a boy named Ingvar Kamprad is born. At the time, nobody could have imagined that his name would one day become associated with one of the most recognizable brands on earth. Kamprad wasn't a child prodigy. He wasn't an exceptional student. Throughout his life, he struggled with dyslexia, which made school difficult for him. In fact, that's one of the reasons IKEA products would later receive names instead of catalog numbers. Remembering a name like Billy was far easier for him than memorizing a string of digits. But he possessed something else, an obsession with business. He started earning money while still a child. He bought matches in bulk from Stockholm and resold them to neighbors at a small profit. Soon, he expanded into seeds, Christmas decorations, pens, wallets, anything that could earn him a few extra krona. It wasn't the products that fascinated him, it was the system. Buy low, sell high, repeat. When he was 17, his father rewarded him with a small sum of money for doing well in school. Most teenagers would have spent it on a vacation or perhaps their first motorcycle. Kamprad decided to start a company. That's how IKEA was born. The name, now recognized across the world, is actually a simple acronym. The I and K come from Ingvar Kamprad. The E and A stand for Elmtarid and Agunnaryd, the farm and village where he grew up. At first, the company had nothing to do with furniture. It sold almost everything: pens, wallets, picture frames, watches, jewelry. Furniture entered the picture only years later, when Kamprad noticed something interesting. People kept asking for it. The problem was that furniture in post-war Sweden was expensive. For many families, furnishing a home could cost several months' worth of wages. Most manufacturers saw this as perfectly normal. Kamprad saw an opportunity. During the 1950s, he began selling furniture at lower prices than his competitors. The industry was furious. Traditional manufacturers accused him of destroying the market. Some suppliers were quietly warned that working with IKEA could cost them other contracts. The young company suddenly found itself under enormous pressure. And that's when something happened that would later be described as one of the most important moments in retail history. Not during a board meeting, not at a conference, not in a strategy session, but while trying to load a table into a customer's car. The table simply wouldn't fit. At the time, nobody realized that a few unscrewed table legs were about to change the furniture industry forever. At the time, nobody realized that a few unscrewed table legs were about to change the furniture industry forever. Today, it sounds like one of those stories companies tell during corporate training sessions. But for IKEA, it marked the beginning of one of the biggest revolutions in modern retail. According to the version often repeated by the company itself, designer Gillis Lundgren suggested removing the table legs before transportation. The problem disappeared instantly. The table took up less space. It became easier to transport. Warehousing became more efficient. Nobody was talking about flat-pack furniture yet. It was simply a practical solution to a very specific problem. But Kamprad immediately saw something others missed. If every piece of furniture occupied less space, transportation costs would fall. If transportation costs fell, prices could be reduced. If prices dropped, more customers would buy. It was simple math. Yet that simple equation would transform an entire industry. During the 1960s and 1970s, most furniture manufacturers still thought in terms of products. IKEA was beginning to think in terms of systems. Every cent saved on packaging, shipping, storage, or handling mattered. Kamprad could spend hours discussing details that seemed ridiculous to other business owners. He cared about the size of a cardboard box, the number of screws included in a package, or how much empty space remained inside a truck. In many ways, he behaved less like the owner of a furniture company and more like a logistics engineer obsessed with efficiency. That obsession quickly paid off. The problem was that IKEA's success was becoming increasingly irritating to its competitors. Traditional Swedish furniture manufacturers struggled to understand how a relatively small company could sell products at lower prices while growing faster than businesses that had been around for generations. The tension became so intense that some suppliers were quietly warned that continuing to work with IKEA could jeopardize their relationships with the rest of the industry. For a young company, that could have been disastrous. Once again, Kamprad responded in a way nobody expected. Instead of fighting to keep local suppliers, he began looking abroad. His attention turned toward Eastern Europe. Today, that may sound completely normal. But remember, this was the middle of the Cold War. For many Western companies, doing business behind the Iron Curtain seemed risky, unusual, and in some cases, unthinkable. IKEA saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. One of the most important countries quickly became Poland. The company began working with Polish manufacturers as early as the 1960s. Over time, the relationship grew so rapidly that Poland became one of IKEA's most important production hubs. Even today, a significant portion of IKEA furniture is manufactured there. In some years, roughly 1 out of every 5 IKEA products sold worldwide originated from Polish factories. At the same time, IKEA was discovering something even more valuable than low-cost manufacturing. Customers weren't just coming to buy furniture anymore. They were coming for an experience. Most furniture stores operated in roughly the same way. You walked in, looked at a product, made a decision, and left. The faster the process, the better. IKEA decided to do the exact opposite. The company wanted customers to stay as long as possible. It sounds obvious now, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Stores began to resemble giant labyrinths. You didn't immediately reach the bookshelf or desk you came to buy. Instead, you walked through dozens of carefully designed room displays, tiny studio apartments, family living rooms, children's bedrooms, kitchens, home offices. IKEA was no longer selling furniture. It was selling possibilities. Customers weren't looking at a dresser. They were imagining their future bedroom. They weren't buying a lamp. They were imagining evenings spent reading beneath its light. That was the critical difference. Competitors displayed products. IKEA displayed lifestyles. And the company quickly noticed another pattern. The longer people stayed in the store, the more they spent. That's where the restaurants came in. To many observers, selling meatballs inside a furniture store seemed completely absurd. Kamprad looked at the numbers. Hungry customers leave sooner. Well-fed customers stay longer. Today, IKEA restaurants serve hundreds of millions of visitors every year, and the number of meatballs sold annually is counted in the hundreds of millions of portions. Ironically, one of the most recognizable products associated with IKEA isn't a chair, a sofa, or a bookshelf. It's a plate of Swedish meatballs. Slowly, everything began working together, like a perfectly engineered machine. Customers arrived intending to buy a cabinet. They spent several hours inside the store. They ate lunch. They picked up candles, storage boxes, pillows, lamps, and kitchen accessories they had never planned to buy. Then they drove home with a full car and the feeling that they had made a smart financial decision. Meanwhile, IKEA's revenue exploded. New stores opened across Europe, then North America, and eventually Asia. By the end of the 20th century, IKEA had become a global giant. And that's exactly when questions began to emerge that couldn't be solved with a smarter package design or cheaper transportation. Because the larger the company became, the more people started asking what was happening behind the beautifully designed showrooms and perfectly staged living rooms. For years, it seemed as if IKEA had discovered the perfect business model. Customers were happy, prices remained low, stores were packed. The company was growing faster than most of its competitors. At some point, people almost started treating its success as something inevitable. But the history of large corporations shows that this is often when the biggest problems begin. They don't come from competitors. They don't come from bad strategy. They emerge deep inside systems that have worked so well for so long that nobody bothers asking uncomfortable questions. For IKEA, those questions started appearing in the early 1990s. Journalists and social organizations became increasingly interested in working conditions among suppliers serving Western brands. Globalization was accelerating. Manufacturing was moving to lower-cost regions. Consumers began asking who was really paying the price for cheap products. Eventually, attention turned toward IKEA as well. The most serious allegations involved child labor among some suppliers operating in South Asia. It was the kind of crisis capable of destroying a reputation built over decades. Suddenly, a company associated with affordable design, family-friendly shopping, and Scandinavian simplicity found itself at the center of a global debate about business ethics. For many customers, it came as a shock. A difficult question emerged. Were low prices always the result of better logistics and smarter operations? Or did they sometimes exist because someone on the other side of the world was paying the hidden cost with their health, their future, or even their childhood? In 1994, Swedish television aired a documentary investigating child labor in the carpet industry. The report also included references to suppliers connected to IKEA. Many companies in a similar position might have tried to deny responsibility or simply blame subcontractors. IKEA took a different approach. The company openly acknowledged that the risk existed and that it required systematic action. Supplier audits became stricter. Monitoring programs expanded. IKEA began working with organizations such as UNICEF and Save the Children, not because it suddenly transformed into a charity, but because it understood something extremely important. In a global economy, reputation can become as valuable as the product itself. You can rebuild a factory. You can replace a supplier. Rebuilding trust is far more difficult. But that wasn't the end of the controversy. As the years passed, new questions emerged. This time, they focused on the environment. Critics argued that IKEA encouraged people to constantly replace and upgrade products. Supporters countered that the company's enormous scale allowed it to invest heavily in sustainability. In many ways, both sides had a point. IKEA eventually became one of the world's largest private investors in renewable energy. The company spent billions of euros on wind farms, solar installations, and environmental initiatives. Of course, these efforts didn't silence every critic. An organization of that size will always attract scrutiny. But they demonstrated something important. IKEA was beginning to treat social and environmental responsibility as a business strategy rather than a public relations exercise. Looking back, it's difficult to argue that IKEA's success was ever just about furniture. It wasn't even about low prices. The company's greatest advantage was something much harder to copy. It consistently viewed problems differently from everyone else. When competitors saw expensive transportation, IKEA saw flat-pack packaging. When other retailers wanted customers to shop quickly, IKEA wanted them to stay longer. When most furniture stores displayed products, IKEA sold visions of a better life. And this brings us back to the question we started with. Why do people become so attached to furniture they have to assemble themselves? The answer turns out to be surprisingly simple. When we invest our own effort into creating something, we begin assigning greater value to it. Psychologists call this phenomenon the IKEA effect. In experiments conducted by Michael Norton, Daniel Mochon, and Dan Ariely, participants consistently valued objects they had assembled themselves more highly than identical objects created by someone else. It didn't matter that the finished products were often imperfect. What mattered was the effort, the time, the involvement. And perhaps that's why the story of IKEA is far more interesting than the story of a furniture company. At its core, it's a story about human nature. It's about how easily we become attached to things we've worked on ourselves. And it's about how a young entrepreneur from a small Swedish village managed to build a company worth tens of billions of dollars by understanding a psychological bias most people never even realize exists. There's a good chance that after hearing this story, you'll glance at a piece of furniture somewhere nearby. Maybe it's a bookshelf, maybe a desk, or a nightstand. And you might remember the evening you spent trying to decipher the instructions, searching for a missing screw, or fighting with a shelf that refused to fit where it was supposed to. You probably still think it was frustrating. But there's also a good chance that the very reason that piece of furniture feels a little more valuable than it should is because a small part of it feels like yours. And that, more than anything else, is why the IKEA effect continues to work.